Kind of interested the city. He thinks it's pretty big because I went around in circles several times. I kind of fooled him a little bit. But anyway, Larry A. Reed, Local Preservation Coordinator of the Historical Preservation Division of Wisconsin. And we're real happy to have you here.
Well, thanks. I got a lot of slides. It was 2 months ago tonight that Tom first called me and set up something for early December. Unfortunately, I came down with a terrible cold and had to cancel, or it was postponed, and I thank Tom for doing that. And I'm glad to be here finally to talk about historic preservation. As Tom said, I'm from the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. We have a division of historic preservation that administers Wisconsin's historic preservation program. It includes things I'll be talking about, like briefly tonight. We don't have time to talk about everything, but we have tax credits for rehabbing historic homes, historic commercial buildings. We've got a state historic building code. We've got a number of tools to help citizens and cities preserve their irreplaceable heritage in Wisconsin. It's becoming more and more important to do just that. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight briefly, and also how to get organized to do it, what the benefits are of doing it. And I want to talk with you, and you talk at me too, so that we can find out where you're at in Prescott. If you have any specific questions you want to ask me, please feel free to interrupt me. We'll certainly have time after the slideshow to talk about other things, because as I said, I won't be able to cover everything. But bear with me, because in a half an hour, 45 minutes, I'm going to try to at least give you a sampling of what historic preservation is all about. Tom took me on a tour. I think Prescott has an amazing physical, natural setting. And I was truly impressed and surprised at the number of historic resources that even I, who am not an architectural historian, could see the homes. Some of the buildings downtown, you have to sort of not look at the first stories, but look up above. And the other resources that I know are in the community that we didn't have time to look at, although Tom gave a real close tour. So you're blessed with a beautiful city. It certainly needs some attention in terms of historic preservation downtown. Marvelous collection of early Greek Revival, Italian Age, Gothic Revival homes. Amazing. I didn't know those styles reached this far north in Wisconsin. I thought we had them all in southeastern Wisconsin, where I live in Rock County. But you are blessed with an amazing assortment of architectural styles and historic buildings. And I hope this will be the start or a continuation of your efforts to preserve those marvelous buildings. You had an ordinance for about 3 years to help you. And it's a marvelous tool. I'll be talking about that tonight too. Historic preservation in Wisconsin. And what can it do for your community? Our experience in Wisconsin has indicated that unless you have a historic preservation program, which Prescott has and is beginning to develop, you're going to lose your resources. You're going to lose their economic value. You're going to lose the quality of life that you really want in your community, besides losing your heritage. I mean, losing your past. It's like, when you don't have a past, when the building is destroyed, not only is it gone forever, but as somebody said, a community without historic resources is like a person without a memory. I mean, it's that sad, you're that bereft unless you take care of it. This was a lovely cobblestone house down in Janesville, the Bell Cottage. It was in the wrong place, but it could have been saved. This beautiful, marvelous technique brought from New York of planting cobblestones and cement to make the facade of what was a rough rubble stone house look beautiful. Unfortunately, the city of Janesville could not save it. And we're losing in Wisconsin these rare cobblestone structures simply because at this time, a few years ago, the city of Janesville was not cognizant enough of its resources, did not take enough action. And so that lovely house was lost. But with a historic preservation program, your community can benefit. I can see its benefits already, and talking to Tom, the progress that is beginning to be made, awareness of what your resources are. Some of you are proud owners of these resources and are taking good care of them. Certainly there are those aesthetic improvements to make the community look better. But we're discovering there are economic benefits to be gained from having a historic preservation program. Real dollars and cents, maybe. Certainly the quality of life is improved. The fact that you have a heritage that your children, yourselves, future generations will understand your heritage and appreciate your community more. And certainly the bottom line is always preserving our historic and prehistoric heritage, I might add. If you're fortunate enough to have any prehistoric resources, Indian mounds, other Native American cultural resources, those are beginning to be more and more valuable and more appreciated. For instance, this little, not really a little building, an amazing building in fact, Shapen was in it 3 years ago. It's a stove wood constructed building, stove length cords of wood piled up like wood piles, mortared together. Here you see the butt ends of the logs sticking out. In Oneida County near Jennings, this marvelous building, the Michikowski General Store, Boarding House and Saloon, was in this shape when it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, being of national significance. It's the largest commercial stove wood constructed building in the nation, as far as we know. But look at what shape it was in a few years ago. But the determination of that community and others to save this building resulted in its total restoration and rehabilitation. That's what it looks like today. It's now used as a community center and other functions. But the Michikowski House rose like a phoenix from the ashes because the citizens cared. They searched out resources, private monies, basically, the expertise on stove wood constructed buildings, and managed to save it. That's a real exceptional, but obviously very illuminating case of preservation that worked in that community. Aesthetic improvements. What do we mean by that? How do we go about ensuring that you get these benefits? Well, you got to know something about rehabbing historic buildings. If you're fortunate enough, you have citizens, architects, designers in your community who are sensitive to historic architecture and can help serve on your historic preservation committee, or at least serve to be a resource of information for your fellow citizens who want to rehab their buildings correctly. There are lots of do's and don'ts. There are a lot of bad things that can be done to historic buildings as well as the right things. By the way, I should plug right now our 2 architects on our staff in the Division of Historic Preservation. We have 2 staff architects. Unfortunately, they can't travel around the state constantly, but they certainly can send materials on rehab. They can talk to you on the phone. They can respond to letters if you send photographs now. It's not that we're trying to take any business away from private architects, mind you, but these 2 guys are expert in treatment of historic buildings. Aesthetic improvements, though, can result from proper planning in the community. Certainly, you all should be interested in what your planning commission is doing, what plans are being developed in terms of their aesthetic impact, whether it's landscaping, streetscaping, or actual rehab of buildings, or the siting of new construction. Frankly, because there is value in aesthetics. I mean, I think our society is finally realizing that the beautiful, the cultural, has an important dollar and sense, in both senses of the word, value to our community. For instance, this is my house where I live in Cooksville, Wisconsin. It doesn't look like that anymore, but when I bought it in Rock County, a little historic district listed in the National Register, protected by an ordinance, I might add, and I serve on the Cooksville Historic District Committee. It was in very sad shape. 1848 Greek Revival house. There is a new roof on it in this photo, but it was in pretty bad shape. But I had a very good architect. We managed to turn that little duck of a house into a marvelous, livable, energy efficient, and charming historic house. We did put a new addition on, and I'll show you that phase of the project. Some of our historic houses in Rock County are very small because when the Yankee settlers came there, they either had a log cabin or a very small frame house close to the beam house. This is the rear end of that same house, and we added a new addition. Contemporary in design, yet obviously in some ways echoing the clapboards and the roof pitches of the historic house, which is on the right. So you can add on to these houses appropriately, as well as rehab them appropriately. Oh, you can name a number of cities in Wisconsin now that have been working at it for a number of years. Bayfield is a lovely setting. Brownstone buildings, downtown Bayfield. A lovely collection of large Queen Anne style houses from the late 19th century. Many of them bed and breakfasts now, because they know in Bayfield which side of the bread their butter was on many, many years ago, and that is tourism. Including this imposing building, the Cooperage, the Bayfield cooperage where they used to make the barrels for the fish industry. The owner said, I don't want to invest in that building. I have a seasonal sort of tourism thing where I sell barrels and pretend I make them and so on, but only in the summertime. I can't afford to invest in it. Well, he realized that there were tax credits for rehabbing a historic building. And that made it worth his while to invest money in the building. So the Booth Cooperage is now a beautiful addition to the Bayfield Historic District, but also it was worth the owner's while to invest in that building. Cedarburg in Ozaukee County is famous for close to 30 years now of historic preservation activities, including the mayor in the old days tearing up building permits that he didn't like because they were going to harm the historic properties in downtown Cedarburg. Now they're more organized and do it more legally through a Cedarburg Historic Preservation Commission, not unlike your Prescott Historic Preservation Committee, through an ordinance, in other words. So Cedarburg did a marvelous job of adaptively reusing many of the stone mill buildings. This is now sort of a mini mall. But they did it tastefully, without excessive signage, without excessive phony colonialism of any kind, just respecting the existing architecture. And in order to achieve those aesthetic improvements appropriately, there are a number of publications now. Every library right next door should have these on their bookshelves. How to build new buildings in historic districts, how you, as a historic preservation committee, when you review building permits, what kind of design criteria are appropriate. Any number of publications, including some from our office that we have available free of charge. The whole idea is to prevent things like this from happening, covering up our heritage, which was popular in the 1950s and 60s. We were ashamed, I guess, of our lovely buildings. Now they're beginning to take that plastic and tin off, thank goodness, to reveal finally, again, the marvelous heritage underneath those buildings. Unfortunately, this still continues, though. You go in any downtown in Wisconsin, and you still see the sort of wood-shaped shingle, cancerous growth engulfing buildings. In this case, it's a casualty dead on arrival of whoever designed that. There may be a building underneath there of some significance, but you certainly can't come out. But that was the fad also in the 1960s and 70s, and as I said, it still happens today, covering up our heritage as if we're ashamed of it, or at least we don't appreciate it for what it is. I think, fortunately, the attitude is changing. Even something as simple as paint colors, choosing the right colors and placing the right colors on a building can make all the difference in the world. I mean, this is a sort of a Greek Revival house, but that yellow and blue scheme is not going to enhance the architecture of that particular building. Probably was white, as Greek Revival buildings were. So even something like paint colors make a tremendous difference in the aesthetic qualities that your community can have or your historical heritage can have. We're finding that historic preservation indeed does provide economic improvements if the historic preservation program is put into action and carried out and followed through. Wisconsin has a Main Street program now. There are 15 cities in Wisconsin that have been chosen as the pilot cities for Wisconsin's Main Street program. Soon, I hope, the Main Street office and the Department of Development will be able to help cities like Prescott that are not officially chosen Main Street cities, but will be able to share in the knowledge that these 15 pilot cities are learning. How do you revitalize downtowns? We have some information on how to revitalize downtowns in our office, how to revitalize neighborhoods through historic preservation, creating districts, using those tax credits, creating ordinances like what you have in Prescott. Certainly, historic preservation is proven nationally to attract not only new residents, new visitors in terms of tourism, but actually new businesses. I mean, businesses like to locate in an area that is attractive, that they know is attracting customers already. Downtown Prescott certainly has that potential. But as I was talking to folks this afternoon, it's not yet realized. There are some interesting buildings, and hopefully when the owners decide to do something in terms of improvements, they should, I hope, be educated to the point where they will do the right thing. You're not going to instantly see downtown Prescott tear off all of the false brick or all of the wood shingle awnings or all the inappropriate rehabs. But over time, that will happen if you really want it to happen. Certainly, historic preservation has proven to improve or at least stabilize property values in those communities communities where it's falling, you start revitalizing, it does help to stabilize or actually improve property values, which means the tax base for the city increases. A few examples. Mineral Point, Wisconsin is another community that in the last, certainly 10 years has taken very seriously its historic resources and finally has overcome the lethargy, that old, when you live in a town for 50 years, you've seen these buildings every day of your life, there's nothing special about them, in fact they're old. That attitude has been overcome, I think, at Mineral Point, but it took a long time. A lot of people are investing money in those buildings at that point because they realize as a rural agricultural community, economic times just ain't very good for those kind of small towns. They have to look to other sources of income and attraction. One of them is tourism. Mineral Point is also craftsmen and artists. So even the residential areas of Mineral Point are really being spruced up. Of course, that's a very early part of Wisconsin, late 1830s to 1840s. Gothic revival in the 1860s. Structures, a wealth of architectural resources in that area. As I said, the Main Street program in Wisconsin, which uses historic preservation as one of its main features, can help to revitalize downtown. It's a matter of choosing what kind of lighting fixtures you're going to have. It's a matter of encouraging appropriate signage. And we could spend 2 or 3 hours talking just about downtown revitalization. By the way, there are videotapes and slideshows that you can borrow from the Wisconsin Main Street office if you really want to get into downtown revitalization. Sturgeon Bay decided it had to attract people off the highway that are zipping up further north in Door County to come to downtown Sturgeon Bay. So many years ago, Sturgeon Bay created a historic district downtown. Hung banners outside proclaiming that Sturgeon Bay was historic. They have an ordinance in that community. So more and more cities in Wisconsin are realizing that we need a preservation program that's an official policy in the community. If it's just a private group, and I'll talk more about this later, it just isn't the sense of it being an important fact of your life in this community. So with a city ordinance that you have, you're already a long jump ahead of other communities. Adaptive reuse in terms of economic considerations in the community is very important. This is an old depot in Kendall, Wisconsin, out of the road. County, that now is a DNR, actually, state-owned facility on the trail there. But it's an important concept to keep in mind. If you have old buildings and they're no longer needed as firehouses, as in the case of this building in Jefferson, Wisconsin, Jefferson County, what do you do with an old building that no longer is needed as a school or as a firehouse or as a church for that matter? You can adaptively reuse them. In this case, the Jefferson fire station was bought by developers using the federal tax credits and rehabbed into office space. They had to keep, to be eligible for the historic preservation tax credits, the firehouse-ness look to that building, which meant keeping sort of firehouse doors, but you can see you can rehab, renovate historic buildings into useful buildings, even with a different use. And you can even get tax credits from the state and federal government for doing so. Economic benefits include tourism. I don't know of a single community in Wisconsin that's serious about either economic development or historic preservation that doesn't have walking tour guide books of one kind or another, either sold or distributed free of charge to visitors, and to residents for that matter. Residents are not always aware of the resources there. Another benefit of the historic preservation program is improved quality of life. It's a little harder to quantify this or put your finger on it, but certainly I think we all know when we're in a community, in a neighborhood, on a property that has been taken care of. We have that sense of time and place where that building belonged, where that Main Street belonged, and whether it's the 1840s or the 1930s for that matter, we sense if the historic preservation program is working properly, that the architecture works with the street lamps, works with the sidewalks, works with the curbs, works with the signage, works with the fences in the neighborhood, works from building to building, because there's a program of awareness and education that encourages, and in some cases with strong ordinances requires, people do certain things and not do other things. They're going to modernize or rehab or hang signs on their buildings. boils down to is really, ultimately, I guess, is a kind of that psychological, spiritual, emotional comfort we get from knowing we're living with our past in the present, and yet the future is spread out before us as it always is. But there is that comforting blanket of your heritage that's important. I use a pile of Richardsonian Romanesque bricks and stone, and I think it's safe, but you have to watch those politicians. You never know what they're going to do. There's a courthouse historic district surrounding that, a commercial district, which is not in good shape yet. They don't have an ordinance, historic preservation ordinance in the state of Illinois. So they have a hard time getting owners to conform to certain principles of design. I own this church in Cooksville across the street from my house. When I bought it, all the steeples and the bell tower were missing, and they were used as the town hall. It was painted white, didn't have a porch. It was in a real mess. But I managed to restore, thanks to old photographs, the little minarets and the bell tower. And it is a beautiful little Romanesque 1879 church. I unfortunately don't have a use for it yet, except to store my old junk. But I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But I had to save that church from being used as a barn. That was its next life, from city town hall to a barn. But it took a lot of effort, to rehab it, and I'm certainly not realizing any economic gain. But I certainly feel more comfortable psychologically, spiritually, aesthetically to have this across the street for me now than hopefully it was before, or not to have anything at all. Fort Atkinson has a little Merchants Avenue Historic District listed in the National Register of Historic Places and the State Register of Historic Places. But it's really a charming little historic district of about 30 buildings, 3 blocks long, Greek Revival, Italianate over here, a fine collection of Fort Atkinson's 1850, 1860, 1870 architecture as a historic district. And they're very proud of it, and the people that live there are taking good care of it. And when you stroll down that street, you do get a sense of where you're at in time. It's today, of course, but the works of art from the past are there for you to see too. Up in Duarte County, the Pilgrim Farmstead, a good example in Wisconsin of our rural heritage. Pomeranian German farmers settled here in the 1870s, built a lovely house, barn, even the wind tower, the windmill added in 1917, all create a wonderful collection of farm buildings, part of our rural ethnic heritage that's listed in the National Register and that the owners are very proud of. They're trying very hard to preserve these properties. It's harder to preserve rural properties in Wisconsin because there aren't, what shall I say, there isn't the concern. They have no neighbors. If this runs down, there are no neighbors to say, hey, Mr. Jones, how about fixing up your property? I'll even find some good books for you to read, and I'll even find out if there are tax credits for it. So it's hard in Wisconsin. And of course, Wisconsin means rural, means barns, but we're losing them all the time. And that is the bottom line. How do we save our heritage? As we build the future, we're going to build new buildings, no question about it. Some old buildings are going to have to be demolished because they're unsafe or because of fire or because of other reasons. But the most significant parts of our heritage is really worth, as you're doing in Prescott for your ordinance, getting serious about it, really planning what are we going to do downtown. Now that we move the library up here, the city hall up here, does that mean fewer people are going to go downtown? Yes. But the bridge, maybe there'll be more visitors going downtown. So maybe you're going to balance the fact that you stole away important downtown buildings and functions and put them way up here on the hill by increased tourism downtown. It's just, you really are going to have to address that problem, and I know the Chamber of Commerce, Sally, to say yes, they are getting serious about that. But anyway, getting back to our heritage. Well, for you, we're probably all converted already, I think. I feel like a preacher sometimes, preaching those who are already converted. I think most of you have a sense of your heritage and want to preserve it. So let me talk a little bit about, I didn't take any of these slides, by the way. I can't take any credit. One of Wisconsin's great national historic landmarks in Racine the Johnson and Sons Wax Company buildings designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, the administrative buildings in 1937 and the tower in 1946, I think. Anyway, relatively recent 20th century buildings, but obviously the work of great master architects. So they're significant and part of our Wisconsin's heritage, indeed part of the world's heritage. This is another real class act of architecture, the Farmers and Merchants Union Bank in Columbus, Wisconsin. I'm talking about the building on the right, not the building on the left. Prairie School style bank, 1919, designed by Louis Sullivan. That's a little jewel of a bank. We don't have, it's the only one that we have in Wisconsin, designed by Louis Sullivan, Prairie School style. So we have these magnificent buildings designed by great architects, but we also have humble dwellings. The Namur Belgian-American Historic District in Door County, the nation's largest collection of Belgian-American buildings in our country. We have humble dwellings. They're not designed by Frank Lloyd Wright or Louis Sullivan. They're very simple ethnic structures, log, brick, a large collection of buildings in this. I think it's about a 10 square mile area of Door County. A very important part of Wisconsin's and our nation's ethnic heritage. As is this little church. I did not see it in person up in Bayfield County, Cornucopia, St. Mary's, I think it's historically St. Mary's Russian Orthodox Church. But a surprising and wonderful part of Wisconsin's heritage to have this little onion dome perched up there in Bayfield County. Part of our Norwegian heritage down in Stoughton, Wisconsin, in Dane County. The Ingebretson Loft House. It's hard to see the loft extending out over the porch behind you. I guess a Stoughton High School class, some madrigal singer or something. But obviously in sad shape, and the owner a few years ago was very concerned how he was going to be able to afford to keep that building, which is on private property, in good repair. But a very early example of Norwegian log cabin construction in Wisconsin, probably dating from the 1840s. Well, to sum up, before I get into the next little short session of my slideshow, yeah, we believe historic preservation can do a lot of these things for Prescott in this part of Wisconsin. If you really vigorously promote it, carry out the program, and carry on for as many years as it takes. How do you do it? Okay, as I said, you're already starting to do it. But let me just run through some principles of historic preservation in terms of a local program. You got to get organized. Now, you're already organized. You've got a local historical society. In terms of preservation, more importantly, you have a Prescott city ordinance that created the Prescott Historic Preservation Committee. It's an advisory committee to the Plan Commission to designate properties, make them local landmarks, your register in Prescott, and then to review building and demolition permits and other actions to ensure that inadvertently or even vertently somebody doesn't destroy or harm historic properties in Prescott. So since we've gone beyond this stage of getting organized, maybe we need a bigger organization or a better funded organization, I don't know. Getting organized means lots of meetings like this, educational meetings, planning meetings, takes time, volunteer time. But it's the only way to go. In Wisconsin, we even have an organization. This is a slide photo of it. Its first meeting. We have a Wisconsin Association of Historic Preservation Commissions. In fact, we'll be meeting March 23rd in Madison on a Saturday to talk about ordinances and protecting properties and doing surveys to inventory properties and other topics of interest to hardcore preservationists like Landmarks Commission and Historic Preservation Commission on March 23rd. You'll be hearing more about that as we listen. We even try to get, now this is obviously I haven't gotten a shot yet of Governor Thompson, but this is ex-Governor Tony Earl. You even have to get your politicians organized at the local level and attend their meetings as well as at the state level. We have a very strong organization in Wisconsin. It's new, but it's called the Wisconsin Trust for Historic Preservation, and they're very interested in lobbying and creating new laws, new tools for preservation in Wisconsin. We've been terribly successful. I work with that organization a lot. We'll have a lot of new legislation introduced this year in Wisconsin. Unfortunately, because of Wisconsin's moving deficit, we may not get much of it passed, but that doesn't stop us. We'll continue to try to get more tools to help preserve our heritage. So you got to get organized at all levels. Once you're organized, what do? What's the first step in preserving your heritage? Well, again, as you've already started to do very successfully, is find out what you got. What do we have in Prescott that's worth preserving? What do we have? You have to survey the community, either all at once, which can cost you $30,000, $40,000 to hire an outside consultant and come in and do it, or you can do it volunteer labor, building by building, researching them, evaluating them, documenting their significance. We have matching grants of money to do just that. They're called survey and planning sub-grants of money. This year, I think we're going to make about 10 grants of that money to 10 communities in Wisconsin to do this kind of activity. Certainly part of a survey is to publicize your information. You've got to tell the whole community, hey, we got stuff here, resources worth saving. What is a survey? Well, it's somebody who goes out and looks at the buildings, evaluate their architecture, researches them to evaluate their history. Here's a surveyor out in the field evaluating buildings. That's what a survey does. The results get, well, we can do archaeological surveys too, of course. The results of these surveys get published so the community, the library, city planners, city commissioners, all can see what you got. The cover of the survey we funded around Lake G or G Lake, I should say, down in we've done surveys, funded surveys in lots of cities around the state, and the products vary from very useful to gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. It all depends on how you use the results of the survey, obviously. Once the survey is done, once you know what you got, or you're continuing the survey, what do you do with this information? What do you do now that we know we have all these historic resources in Prescott? Well, you plan for their preservation. We've already officially designated Prescott a number of properties that are now part of the Prescott Historic Registry. You can also nominate those properties to the National Register of Historic Places, or we now have a state register of historic places as well. And certainly your historic property should be, however you do it, another 2-hour lecture, integrated into city planning, development planning. We integrate our survey materials in our office with the Department of Transportation when they always want to tear down all the bridges, highway construction, DNR. All of those state agencies are required to work with our office as they create plans, which invariably mean, from their point of view, destroying anything that gets in the way of their plans while we're there saying, no, wait. We sometimes win some of those battles, but it's important to have local plans for development, for preservation. When your roads start to get widened by Department of Transportation, you want to be ready for that. The City of La Crosse does not have a great track record on historic preservation, frankly, but they do put pretty plaques in there, officially designated historic buildings, which is a form of public education, awareness, and so on. Sheboygan County does it on a county-wide basis through a private group. They landmark buildings throughout Sheboygan County, which is an ambitious thing to do. Over in rural Wisconsin, rural in Waupaca County, there is the Rural on the Crystal River Historic District. A wonderful little community that I didn't know about until maybe 5 years ago, frankly. I didn't know where rural Wisconsin was. A marvelous collection of Greek Revival, Italianate style buildings along the Crystal River. It is now a historic district listed in the National and State Registers. Unfortunately, before they got to that stage of awareness, they constructed a new store next to a little tiny old one. And they realize now, if they'd only known 20 years ago about this historic preservation stuff, the owner, Mr. Weller, would have constructed a different style general store for that. Now struggling with the fact that they know what they've got, it's listed in the National Register, but they have yet to take steps to protect it. They're getting threatened with increased development, modern development, because of the lovely scenic spot they occupy on Crystal River. Some cities actually create written, published plans for preservation. Most of these gather dust on a shelf, frankly. But sometimes they're a good exercise, and sometimes they actually can be useful if they're well written and updated constantly. Okay, so you now know where you're at. You've done your survey, you know what you got. You're planning for preservation, you're designating properties. Then what do? Well, to keep preservation alive, you've got to provide some services in the community. Hopefully, your library will have a bookshelf, or at least be subscribing to preservation publications, buying occasional books. You have brochures for visitors and residents that describe your historic properties and tell everybody how wonderful they are. You might even have an architect in the community, or at least know that our office exists, to get technical information. Somebody wants to clean a brick building, what do? You never sandblast. That permanently destroys the building if you sandblast brick or stone or wood. You could wash it with water, gentle chemicals are the best way to clean. So sometimes you think, oh, sandblasting, everybody does that. Well, worst thing you can do. It's still being done, however. Sometimes communities are wealthy enough to actually have financial programs of their own to help owners of historic buildings. Prescott isn't in terms of what it has in its bank account, but some cities actually do have low-interest loans, no-interest loans, or actually grants of money to help owners. Sometimes it's only $500 or $1,000, but that can buy it. And other things help fix up the way. Well, some illustrations of what communities have done to educate visitors and residents. These are the kind of publications we have in our office for loan. We have a lot of these little leaflets that address specific problems in preservation, called preservation briefs. We talk about painting and adding on to historic buildings and so on. Those are available free of charge. As I said, some communities have grants of money to help fix up those rotten boards on lovely porches instead of tearing the entire porch off and using important features. Our office occasionally has grants of money. We don't this year, but in the past we occasionally had some money from the federal government to pass out as matching grants of money to owners of National Registers. So stay tuned, we're going to have some in 1992. The bottom line, though, of all of this preservation stuff is protecting the property. These are probably the 4 ways properties get protected. If we were all born with a natural preservation ethic, in other words, we knew it was morally wrong or ethically wrong to destroy our heritage, we wouldn't need any of these others. I mean, we'd all do the right thing. But unfortunately, we don't. So many communities enact historic preservation ordinances, as the city of Prescott has, to ensure to some degree that heritage is given its due consideration before tearing it down. Sometimes just a planning process can do it. If you have enlightened planners in your community, or individual property owners, you can actually protect your historic property by permanently attaching an easement or a restricted covenant to the property. And so individual property owners have that alternative to protecting the property. Well, we have a publication that unfortunately is now out of print, and we're redoing in our office, that discuss historic preservation ordinances and how communities can set up their own local laws that set up a committee or a commission, such as you have. You have a 5-member committee in Prescott. Most cities that are bigger than Prescott have 7 or 9. Yes. If you don't protect your heritage, you don't know what you got, aren't taking care of it, this is what can happen as it happens. We're sneaky. It's gone. The Daisy Hill puppy farm is gone. And they built a 6-story parking garage. We're sneaky. Can't stand it. It's very vocal. You're parking on my memories. Oh, poor sneaky. How could they do it? How could they build that? Tear down the place where I was born and build a 6-story parking garage. Wait a minute. Never optimistic. Maybe that wasn't a 6-story parking garage. Maybe it was a huge monument erected to mark the place of my birth. Woodstock knows better. It was a six-story apartment. So part of Snoopy's heritage is lost forever. Well, that's my slideshow. Obviously, I ran through lots of things very quickly. Maybe not quickly enough. And obviously without a lot of detail, but I think that gives you a good overall idea on what historic preservation can do for you in Prescott, and a little bit on how to go about doing it. Obviously, it's much more complex than that, than 30 minutes or 45 minutes, I guess. Now you all got to wake up and nobody interrupted me because I was talking so much, and I wanted to get through the slides so that we now have a chance to ask questions about anything in terms of historic preservation. And if I don't know the answers, I'll tell you who to call in our office in Madison, or send you some information. So, any questions? You're going to get some propaganda here too if you want it. I brought a whole bunch of stuff with me. I'll just leave it up here in the chair for you to take or not take as you wish. How are you doing in Prescott? Some parts of Prescott look pretty good to me today. Other parts, now you're in need of preservation.
Well, look good.
So I was surprised at the quantity and the quality of the residential architecture in Prescott. Some of them are in marvelous shape. They've been well taken care of, obviously. They're very impressive houses, very large, sophisticated Greek Revival, Italianate. I was disappointed in the downtown. I didn't realize that it had so many alterations on its first ground floors, but that's what happens in Wisconsin and everywhere in the country in the 1950s and 60s. Yours is so permanent. Some of it looks so permanent with brick and so on. It's going to be hard to convince the owner to tear all that out and do it the proper way. Many times, if it's only covered with plastic or wood or tin, you can tear that off fairly easily and reveal underneath the original wrought iron columns or cast iron this or whatever. Often it's underneath that stuff. Your setting is so on the river, and the little city park down there by the old mill and the powerhouse down there, which you own, the city owns. Great potential, absolutely marvelous potential there. The downtown definitely needs some attention, but seems to be interested in giving it some attention, creating some plans, some awareness, some new ideas, hopefully that will help preserve its architecture. There are going to have to be new buildings built, or infill maybe. There's nothing wrong with contemporary architecture, nothing wrong with modern design that's associated with historic buildings. If you've lost the storefront on the building, with the first floor storefront, it's gone. We recommend doing a contemporary storefront. We don't recommend doing a phony historic storefront. We recommend doing something contemporary that harmonizes, obviously, with the rest of the building. We don't want you to create a false sense of your history by doing, as you often see in everyone downtown, let's do Williamsburg, let's do some painted windows and some shutters and lots of eagles, and then we'll have history in that downtown. No, that's not Prescott's history. That's phony colonial history. So you have to be very careful on what you do when you are rehabbing a building like you have downtown. If something's actually missing, what do you do? Well, you have a lot of old photographs. You might actually want to reconstruct something very carefully at great expense. That's certainly laudable. It's also good. Nothing wrong with contemporary architecture. Fit right in with the building.
Except if you put between two old houses, which happened in Prescott.
Well, I saw one example of a very contemporary house in between two older historic houses that did not harmonize, obviously. You can build new houses in amongst historic houses, no problem, but you do have to watch the scale, the setbacks, and certain of the details of the historic houses. To harmonize, you really have to bring that into play with the contemporary design. Good architects can do that. But I have nothing against modern architecture, believe me. However, it should harmonize with the neighborhood. Whether it's a historic neighborhood or whatever, it still should harmonize with its setting. Yes,
Do
sir.
any of these communities have teeth in their preservation ordinances?
Oh, a lot of communities have
I've
much,
said
much.
nothing but gums, there's no teeth, whatever.
Yeah.
Well, you do have teeth. If your city council says no to tearing down a building, that's no. That's teeth. The city council in your community has the teeth. Cities like Ode, Neenah, they're bigger cities. Eau Claire, Sturgeon Bay, give that power to the committee or the commission to say no, because the commission is the expert. They're the architects and historians and so on. City council members usually are not, that kind of historic preservation education quality. So you have teeth in the sense that your city council has the authority to say, no, we're not going to issue a demolition permit to tear that down, or no, we're not going to issue a building permit on that designated structure. So once, and you're new at this,
It takes festering, right?
it takes time, as Tom was pointing out, time to designate the historic properties. You're doing that now, making them Prescott landmarks, right? And once they're Prescott landmarks, you can't get a building permit unless you go through the right procedures to get it. Now, the one flaw in your ordinance, not one, but major flaw, is that you, I believe, have to have the permission of the owner before you can make it a landmark. Is that true, or am I? In other words, you can't, if somebody says, nah, I don't want to be a landmark, you can't force them to be a landmark. So that's a kind of a major flaw. Because if you have somebody who owns a house, it's an important house, but they want to tear it down, or they want to add some metal thing to it, and you can't landmark it because they don't want it to be a landmark, you're stuck.
Well, at the time that was being developed, it was said, you can't tell people what to do. Well, you do go some places that you tell people what to do.
Our U.S. Constitution says, yes, we can tell people not to tear down historic properties. The U.S. Supreme Court has already decided that.
But I knew that was one thing I didn't like about it when we were working on it. They said, well, you can't tell them.
Well, you can work with it the way it is, and maybe down the road you can get your ordinance amended, improved, changed, if indeed the citizens and the elected officials want to change it, certainly. But it's a good start. It has flaws, but it really probably isn't up and running yet exactly the way you all would like it to run. You all have got to help, serve on the committee if you're appointed, or volunteer your time to help with the big task of surveying, identifying, and all of this stuff. But many cities have a stronger program because they've been working at it longer, I guess.
Small towns have a strong program.
Yes, my community, Cooksville, where I live in Rock County, it's not incorporated, so we're under the town government. We have a strong ordinance that basically says if an owner of a historic district wants a building permit or wants to do something or wants to tear something down, we say no, it's no. They can't do it. Because we really feel very strongly that we have to protect our historic district of Cooksville. And we've turned down lots of building permits. Or more normally, work with the owners so that their project conform to the aesthetics and to the historic character of our community. And most owners are willing to do that. They're glad to get the advice and have the attention paid to them because they end up with a better project. So it works. We have a strong ordinance.
How long did it take you to put that in to build that? I think a lot of times we think it's going to happen in a couple of years. And
people in Cooksville have been working on it for many years.
it takes a long time.
We did it informally, at first for 10 years, and then finally got the town government to go along with us to include it in our zoning as an ordinance. Cedarburg, as I said, has been working on it for 30 years. I think they've had an ordinance for about 20 years. So it takes time.
You specifically have an ordinance that dictates the type of building you're going to make in mind.
Well, the ordinance doesn't, but it gives the authority to the committee to approve or disapprove of somebody else's plans to build.
And that's never been challenged in court.
That was good.
It's been all of the zoning ordinance and building ordinances, the setbacks, all of that.
Perfectly legal to do that. It's another ordinance. They have the zoning ordinance, they have ordinance for setbacks. And historic preservation ordinance. It's another ordinance, another way of looking at property. If it's historic property, the U.S. Supreme Court says it's our heritage and we have the right to protect it regardless of ownership. We're only caretakers here, let's face it. We're only here a short time to take care of our history, and unless we're good caretakers, we ain't going to have it around. And basically that's what the Supreme Court said. Our heritage is more important than any individual property right.
The problem we run into when we have that situation is using the property line. And the node wants to sell it. And the builder, developer wants to put an inspect on it. And so nobody wants to, so it comes to the council. And so we've got to say no, and we're saying you're being threatened with lawsuits and everything.
We've never had a case in Wisconsin. Elsewhere, as I said, the ordinances have been upheld in other states and nationally. We've never had anything tested in Wisconsin because I guess we do things.
We just put together a shameless plan for the city of Prescott. And one of the parts of that plan was to regulate this specific thing. And the question that we are facing right now, and we were trying to answer is that, can we regulate it? Can we force a person that has a vacant lot that this is the only type of structure?
If it's a historic property, now remember,
Right.
if the vacant lot is a historic site,
Right, it's not, okay, most of these vacant lots are not historic sites.
well, then the way around there,
What
I'll tell you
they have is that
how they do it.
they have houses on each side that have,
Then it's
Then you
historic.
can create a historic district. You can create a historic district.
which we have not.
No, you haven't done that in
But
Prescott.
aren't you
That's what we
marring
did
the
in
homes next to
Cooksville.
it? Aren't you marring the historic nature of the homes on each side by putting something there?
Oh, absolutely. Again, if it's a bad design, I mean, here we're getting into aesthetics, and it's somewhat subjective, but I think in the consensus, we would all know what works and what doesn't. But yes, if you have a historic district, that's what we did in Cooksville. We did not designate individual buildings. We said this whole village has lots of vacant lots in there, and nobody can build on them without getting permission.
So that's what we should do.
Yeah, your residential area that you have,
That's what you end up getting.
Or the first block.
if it is indeed historic, remember you have to legally justify your designations. Now, your entire town is not historic.
Oh, that's right.
It's only certain areas. Mineral Point, almost the entire city is historic. But the city of Madison is not all historic, so they have about 6 different large historic districts that they regulate in different areas of town, commercial, residential. So by doing a survey of Prescott, as you argue, you will find where your historic resources are, and if they're clumped together, so to speak, in other words, more historic buildings than non-historic buildings, you might consider that to be a historic district.
But is that really the case in Prescott? We don't have that many clustered together.
I saw residentially you do.
Our whole block is it, the
Okay.
block north of us is, and across the street from us.
You should go on the walking tour sometime,
But
and
how
I'll be
many?
surprised.
But how many have them all been registered?
We're not saying they don't have to be registered.
They have to be in the historic district.
have
And
to
a prime
be
example of what we're
researched.
talking about is that house. that-
Sure, I know which one you're talking
Yeah,
about.
staked in there, yeah, you saw that too. And it's just and all you can say about the people who do something like that is all the taste is in their mouth. It's the way I explain it.
Well, now the design of that house, which I did see, by the way, I'm sure, I don't know.
It's bad for a modern one.
It's a lovely design. I'd be a proud owner of that house, except it's in the wrong place.
That's right.
And that can make all the world of a difference. in
And then
terms
if
of
you're
that.
the neighbors on either side, it doesn't do too much for you either.
But back to the question, we could declare a historic district without having to have registered all the homes in it.
Right. You have to research all the homes in this potential district, find the boundaries, and then, do a nomination form for that district that would describe and justify the boundaries. Because you have to justify all these things. And then under your ordinance, I think you go through the planning commission again and to the city council to actually designate that historic district. At least I think I'm interpreting your ordinance correctly. I'm not listening to your ordinance. But that's generally how others do it, and I think how your ordinance would work. It's just like designating an individual building, except you're doing a grouping of buildings. So it takes more research, it takes more time, and under your ordinance, it's going to take the consent of the owners in that historic district, I believe. The ordinance reads that way.
Change it.
Yeah, I'd get rid of that, but that's a political issue that you all have to decide. So once you establish that historic district, potential historic district, have the public hearings and so on, then it goes on to the planning commission and the city council for final approval. And then every property in that historic district has, before a building permit or a demolition permit of any kind is issued, has to go through the review process through the Historic Preservation Committee. I think it goes on to the Planning Commission, and then they recommend to the City Council whether to approve it or not approve it. So it's another layer of regulation, yes. I like to look at it as another layer of protection. But on the other hand, when you're gonna build anything in Prescott, I'm sure you have to go through a sort of a review process anyway, of one kind or another, before you get building permit, I hope so. This adds sort of maybe another step or another perspective, let's say, on the issuance of those permits. And believe me,
That
many
brings
cities.
up another problem. Our assessor is not cooperative on this venture. How do we overcome that?
The assessor, now what role does he play besides making you pay a lot of taxes?
Excuse me, building.
Oh, the building inspector. Okay, he's a key person in any, historic preservation, let alone any building program in any community design program. I don't think your ordinance gives him a specific role, but certainly he's the one that people go to when they want permits. And of course, he shouldn't issue permits for officially designated properties or properties in a historic district. So he has to flag those somehow, and then he has to tell
Well, that's where
them
we're failing.
that they can't get their permit
Well,
until
we
they
don't
go
have
through
the
this
district
procedure.
yet.
You don't have a district, so
Oh, see, on that district, who has to step, can the city do that locally, or if we want to register something as a historic district, does that have to go to the state to prove?
We're talking purely about your local
Okay,
program.
that's
That's purely up
what I
to
was
you guys. You can also nominate that district to the state
Yeah.
national register, but that's a whole other
Yeah,
nomination
yeah, I was
process.
wondering for that.
So you can do whatever you want, just so you do it according to your ordinance and according to state statute. Yes, Tom, folks,
Historic district.
That's questionable from my point of view, but you all can make up your own mind about that, of course. The problem with your downtown from the state national register criteria is that it's lost a lot of integrity. In other words, those first floors,
Trucks, isn't it?
hey, yeah, the most important part. Although the back ends of your buildings are becoming very important. As you go down to the river, you turn around and see these rear ends staring at you. Oh my God!
Rear ends is right.
Sometimes the rear ends are more important than the front ends, and that may be almost the case in your downtown.
I have a historic rear end.
Well, I cleaned up all the language, wasn't it?
That'd be unique.
But from our point of view, I'm afraid the downtown has some lovely individual buildings. A couple of lovely individual
Most of the
buildings.
buildings are old.
But they need to-
Because every single building in a historic district would have to be,
Old.
the age, of course, doesn't determine.
No, it doesn't. We have a rule of thumb that says, hey, it should be at least 50 years old, but if it's 30, if it's important, it's important. It doesn't really age. Age just allows historians time to evaluate who's important, what's important. No, it can be any age, but the important thing is that it should retain its integrity or retain its characteristics from its time of significance. Say your downtown district, you've been nominated as a historic district because of the significant that it's showing the development and growth of Prescott from 1860 to 1925. Well then, any building built between 1860 and 1925 should retain its integrity when it was built in that era and not be so altered that if Mr. Prescott came back and maybe he died in 1890, if he came back to your downtown, would he recognize it today? He'd say, gee, no, things have been burned down, things have been altered. Gee, Mr. Prescott wouldn't recognize you downtown. So maybe it's lost a lot of its integrity, original integrity.
Its owners could be influenced by, say, publicity about what can be done to make the fronts take on some of those artificial fronts with
That would make a world of difference, and suddenly you might discover that you do have a historic district downtown, because now instead of having 3 buildings with integrity, you've got 6 or 10. And you might be satisfied then locally to designate it a historic district. By the way, again, you can do whatever you want. But in terms of our program, we want to see more of those buildings have a little bit more
One or
integrity.
two do something, then counterattacks
As
on.
it snowballs, it's amazing how it, sometimes all it is ripping something off, painting it the red color, or doing a more contemporary but sympathetic storefront, and suddenly, hey, it might only cost a few $100, probably $2,000, but we're not talking about spending $100,000 on every building downtown. Some of it can be very simple, and some of it you're never going to recapture because, again, you're not going to convince the owner to invest enough money to tear off the brick storefront and get those lovely round-headed windows back in. That would be very expensive. He's probably not going to do it, but the next time he puts a sign up, he might do it the right proportion, the right style to fit that building, and maybe you could put something I'm not advocating flower boxes because it's probably not historically accurate, but something like that, you know, that idea of capturing flavor without actually having original. But I'm sorry, it's Tom was on
New
this.
lights and new street lights are put in, I don't know if they're needed yet or not, but if those are the types like it would be historical,
If you
then
want.
would that influence maybe, you know, the owners of the building to try to go along with that?
You got to talk about it with the downtown owners and with the Historic Preservation Committee and the chamber and others involved and see which way you want to go downtown. If the consensus is, hey, yeah, this is tourism, let's try to recapture Prescott in the 1890s. Let's do that even with the lighting fixtures. Yeah, you can get replica type lighting fixtures. Nothing wrong with contemporary lighting fixtures again, but if you really want to go all the way, yeah, you can. Don't buy phony colonial lantern type fixtures because those, you know, those are 1776 type that were around. So buy the appropriate lighting fixtures, buy the appropriate benches. Don't you know, buy the stuff that somebody thinks it's historic, you know, like plastered eagles and everything. That's another thing we do in Wisconsin.
We're currently entering into a project with the Department of Transportation. We're going to redo Highway 35 all the way through Main Street.
I think Sally mentioned something.
We are developing a committee to take a look at what we want to do. Are these tax incentives, grants, those types of things that are available? Are they at the state level?
Yeah,
Are we,
basically, everything goes through our office.
what would be nice, because I guess I firmly believe that as this community grows, Highway 10, Highway 10, that's going to become a business district. We're going to be developing out there. In the next 5 years, we're going to see that we need to preserve that downtown, I believe, historical values there.
It seems like the right way to go.
And I guess I would like to see something done at the time when we're starting to work with the DOT. And if we can get enough information where we can talk to the businesses down there and say that there are grants available and there are dollars available to help you restore your fronts, maybe they're willing to put in partial dollars. And that's something that we really, I would like to see done.
You're going to need a good, as you said, you're going to need a good, strong committee down there who's willing to educate themselves first about what's available in terms of our programs, in terms of other programs. The Department of Development down in Madison has the Main Street program and other money maybe. And then, of course, begin educating the downtown property owners and others as to all of these possibilities and begin building a consensus to which way you're going to go and share the information with everybody. I wanted to see if I brought handouts on the tax credits. I think that's the only one I didn't bring. But yes, there are, I think that sounds very reasonable. That's what most communities, they've got these old buildings there. What else are they going to do with them but use them appropriately? You know, you're not going to tear them all down and start all over in Prescott, I hope not. So what's the alternative? Using them appropriately in terms of these.
I'm more concerned about being vacant. We need to do something to establish Prescott, the old Prescott.
Yeah, we're talking about buildings, but buildings don't survive unless they're useful, economically useful. And any preservation program has to address that, as I hinted at, and only hinted at, and that is just fixing up the building is not going to revitalize downtown. You're going to have to look at the market that you serve and what you don't have downtown, what kind of business you need to attract, and how to encourage people to shop downtown, and how to get tourists down. I mean, all of those economic factors have to come into play in any historic preservation program. Our focus tonight was rather narrow on just making the town look pretty and suddenly everything's going to come up roses. That isn't exactly what happens, but that's part of it. Yeah, that's part of it.
I believe Prescott's the most underutilized city on the river. You can go up and down the river anywhere, and you get to Prescott, and we're the ugliest town on the river. You mentioned the rear end storefronts. They are definitely bad. They have no,
I saw them.
you know, our dock area down there is bad. You know, the riprap, we need to do something.
That's the first step, is this hard self-assessment, a hard, close look at where you are in terms of historic preservation, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of beautification, whatever you want to call it. And it can hurt a little bit. But on the other hand, I think there's such potential, it's amazing, I mean, the setting and the location geographically with Twin Cities and being in Wisconsin and southern Minnesota. And having the collection of properties you do have,
We have one big problem though here in the city of Prescott. That's already the city residents are being taxed to death. And what we're talking about takes money. And if we, the city has been very fortunate in the years that we haven't had to raise our mill rate to do the types of things we want to do. It's going to cost money, it's going to cost dollars, it's going to cost tax dollars. I don't know if the city of Prescott residents can afford more tax dollars. We're at a point here in the city where I begin to wonder whether we can sell our homes. Our taxes are so high. Nobody wants to come in. It's a real concern that we have in the city.
People are moving out because of
yeah. Oh, I know, my taxes. But on the other hand, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about tonight, although individuals are going to have to pay for it, somebody's going to have to pay for it. And usually it is the private property owner themselves. I mean, I'm not talking about street lamps and so on, but in terms of storefronts, in terms of homes, in terms of just doing the right thing at home, can again be done at no cost in a sense to the city. Usually the volunteers are running some things. But ultimately, there is going to be an expense when we're talking about large-scale projects like downtowns or any major project that's going to cost. However, there are not many sources of grants actually anymore. Frankly, I'm not an expert on where they are, where the money is at, other than the Department of Development, the Wisconsin Development Fund. There is some money available from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a national preservation. Sometimes money from our office, as I said, for matching grants, and money for educational survey and so on. Next year we hope to have matching money for building things up, but there's such keen competition for it in Wisconsin, you can't count on getting it. So money is harder to come by, no question about it. So some of these plans may have to move slowly, I guess is what we're saying. It doesn't mean they won't happen, they're just not going to happen overnight. And there's no fairy godmother going to come down and wave a wand in Prescott. Just don't do that anymore. Or throw money out the window, they just don't do that anymore. And that's probably just as well. I mean, really, in a sense, because then you learn to really appreciate what you've got, to take better care of it, and to work very hard at keeping it, and feel more part of it, more bought into it. Sometimes slow, though, like I did leave these materials up here. Tom has a final comment, question?
The reason it's far gone by, but there are three things. By this time you know you've been talking to Gary Dunn, our mayor.
I didn't realize that.
And number two, the thing that Bob brought up was the fact that when our ordinance says that when an application for restructuring comes along, the building inspector is supposed to notify us. Now, when I tried to tell the building inspector where this information was, so he said, well, don't worry, don't bother about it, I'm not going to notify you. He ought not have said that. Well, that was, of course, a little discouraging to us. Well, we haven't worried about that so far because we thought we could watch a little bit ourselves. We haven't gotten to the point where we can't handle what we have. And the third item is that our committee has indicated that the houses that we will look at, the structures we look at, are since 1930. I mean, prior to 1930.
Sure. That's reasonable.
And he mentioned that.
And very justifiable. In terms of the 50, you have sort of a 60-year rule. Again, nothing wrong with that. I think, your city council has to be aware of the building inspector. No, in terms of the building inspector. I mean, it's something more that he or she has to do, and it's probably, but they'll get with the program.
I think maybe, we were probably at a pretty, this may be very timely to have this type of meeting because we are currently, as you know, our city business manager has resigned. I'm currently reassessing our building inspector position, how it will work, and maybe we can, set up some guidelines to indoctrinate our new building inspector to work along this line.
Well, I thought,
Because I guess I feel that the council, the planning commission, I think that we're all very supportive of historic preservation. There are a couple that, you know, they still have the feeling, well, don't tell me what I can and what I can't do. But it does come down, and I guess I see this a lot in the city of Prescott, is as long as it doesn't affect you, it's not a big deal, but when it comes time to infringement upon your rights, you raise all kinds of hell, whether it's historic preservation, what it is, we're infringing people's rights, and these people that have lots for sale, they don't like people next door telling them what they can do with that lot. That's their investment, that's their types of things. And I think the district, historical district is a good mode to start on. I think then we can develop and say, this is builders beware, here's what you have to do in this area.
Because with districts, you usually develop criteria, these guidelines, and so on, so that everybody knows, you know, what goes and what doesn't, so like you're not playing surprises on everybody every day of the week. Well, I think I was impressed with what I saw today. I'm impressed with the people I met today, and I thank you all. Yes, certainly.
For our historical district, how many, not every house would be a historical house. I'm thinking of our district. Some of the homes in our block are old and historical, but there are some new ones and very, very nice homes.
Sure.
So what would be the
Well, you just sort of,
historical district?
more historic properties than non-historic properties. Cooksville, where I live, has about 30 historic buildings and about 10 1960s ranch houses. So you just want to maximize the historic properties by your boundaries.
And how big would the district be?
I don't know your resident area then. It looked like there were several, but I don't know. You might have two or three residential districts. You know, all it takes is 2 or more properties to make a district. So you might have several small districts rather than one huge one. Again, I don't know, and I think some of you know, or at least you know enough about that area.
2 blocks, they could include, it's not just one block, it can cross 3 blocks.
Sure. 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 4 blocks.
Within that district, if there was an owner of older homes that didn't wish to be included in that district, would they be excluded then?
They'd certainly let you know that, and you might want to exclude them by drawing the boundaries to exclude them. If they're in the middle of the district, there's no way you can exclude them. I don't know how your ordinance reads with that regard. I think you'd probably go with a 50% rule. In other words, more than 50% have to want this historic district, and if 51% do, then it becomes historic district. That's generally.
You start making exceptions, then all of a sudden you've got all these new districts. I think your point about if 51% say they want the historical district as a district, now you all do it.
Absolutely. That's how it's done.
You have one year, I don't want it, and I don't want it, so this person sells a house. We as planning commission and council have no teeth. It's out of the district, they can build whatever they want, but it's right in the middle of your district, and it's going to have a definite
Why
impact.
wouldn't they want to be included? There's nothing they have to do.
No, but there are things they cannot do if they want to, like tear down their historic house, or even, or tear down their new house and build a 10-story apartment building. I mean, there are some things that, in terms of historic character, that would not be allowed. So it's not that they have to do anything, they're not required to restore anything, they're not, it's just when they're going to do something, they have to go through this process, and probably would be denied if it was some outrageous thing, like demolishing an historic building, or building a building that's totally appropriate for the character of the district. And that's not unreasonable, that's certainly within your purview. Some cities, in fact, don't have historic preservation ordinances in Wisconsin. I wish they did. They just have design ordinances. Nothing to do with history, just make a good design and we're not going to approve that building permit. So control of aesthetics, or aesthetic regulation, if you will, has become totally, not totally, it has legally become accepted. There's still individuals who say, you can't tell me, what's your judgment? Yeah, it's all subjective. Well, no, it isn't anymore. If you come to a consensus, you have criteria, and it's approved through the chain.
But if you don't have that criteria, if you don't have the district, if you have,
You can't say no.
that's right, you have no grounds to say no.
Well, thank you, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.